to know your name and institution as you make your remarks. Thank you.
Thanks, Cheryl Morden from EFAT. Thank you to IFPRI and a great panel. Two questions for Catherine on the governance. Without having the benefit of having read the chapter, I noticed that you did not mention the Committee on World Food Security. So that's what we have to work with at the moment, I guess. That's the best we can do. So just any thoughts you might have on where things stand with CFS at the moment. But secondly, it strikes me that beyond lack of political will, I think we lack any kind of vision for what this should look like. And sitting in Rome, you know, the three agencies are browbeaten constantly about the need to work together and efficiently and so on. But I have yet to hear a really clear and compelling vision about what that should look like, and most especially on governance. So, you know, with heels dragging, the boards of the three organizations met together for the first time last September. Can I say we're online and so I won't say it was meaningless, but it was very close to meaningless, I think. I mean, it was very good that we talked and spoke together, but I don't think it moved us forward at all. And so I'm just wondering your thoughts about where would the vision for this kind of more effective global governance come from?
Catherine, do you want to go ahead and address while we wait for the comments?
Sure. Thank you, Cheryl. Yes, the constant drumbeat in Rome since when I was there a very long time ago was work together, work together, work together. But the structures are not such that that's easy to do. And in fact, sometimes very difficult to do. And so while a lot of that comes from the donor community, it's not necessarily what the donor community does among itself. And right now, and often the donor community is very specific. I mean, one country would be very specific. It says you can only use this for this purpose, or giving WFP something that traditionally UNHCR would receive or something else. So it's not at all coordinated. It's just a mantra, I think. The Committee on Food Security is a nice way to talk about issues, but I don't think it's where your vision that I agree with you we desperately need is going to come from, and I don't think it's senior enough really to do that over any long period of time or a short period of time. So it's good that there's this discussions, but it's not there's no there over the long term. So where is it going to come from? Really, again, I think that if a few influential governments could be motivated to really try to take on creating this vision and then creating the systems that would serve it, and including, as Danny said, the importance of the view of the people that are actually we're supposed to try to help. That could be a motivating factor. Remember, years ago, the Nordic countries got together and made proposals within the construct of the UN that dramatically changed the way that the development/humanitarian organizations work. I think that kind of input could be useful in this context. But somebody has to do it, and I don't know who that somebody is.
Thank you, Catherine. Let me come back into the room right here, unless anybody in the panel wanted to respond. If not, I'll come back to the room right here. There's a mic coming your way.
Hi, I'm Bill Burke, Michigan State University. Shingen, you talked about in your opening remarks the amount of data that IFPRI's been sharing, and everybody I think has talked about the opportunities that big data is presenting. I've done a lot of work collecting survey data, and I think one of the really amazing opportunities is the increasing high resolution of remote sensing data on natural resource bases. But I think something that's going to become a bigger problem, if it's not one that we haven't paid enough attention to already, is how do you reconcile integrating those data sources with household surveys and protecting the privacy of the farmers that you're surveying? Because in order to do that, in order to integrate those data resources, you need to geo-reference these households, right? And as long as that's proprietary data, that's fine, and you can do that safely. But how do you reconcile that with open access, which we all agree is important as well?
Thank you very much. Let me collect one or two, and I will also give an alert to the Indira, the author of the big data, if she wants to come in later on to respond. I noticed a hand right up there. Please, Amanda. And then Melissa will come to Margaret here.
Good morning. Nadim Khouri, supporting the Cairo office of IFPRI. My question is for Dan Glickman. I have to say I used to watch you on C-SPAN when you were a congressman, and to appreciate a lot. If you can build a little bit on what you mentioned of the leadership that the Congress is taking on global food security. There was, of course, I think last year or the year before, a Global Food Security Act that was passed that kind of institutionalized a bit more so that it's not just presidential or emergency interventions, but there is a strategic view. How do you see the future of implementing this and the roles between the executive and Congress? Thank you.
And Nadim, thank you for your contribution to the MENA chapter. Appreciate that. We have Margaret right here.
Thank you. Margaret Ziegler, Global Harvest Initiative, and I've been in Washington for a while. I remember the wonderful days of the leadership of Catherine in these good old multilateral days when the U.S. was very, very much a global leader, and I think we still are. And Dan, when you were in charge of things like the entertainment industry group and agriculture and aerospace, and things were great. So we need you back, and we appreciate your bipartisan voice. I do think that it's a very real felt concern, not only in the heartland of America, but globally, about the effects of globalization. And I think we haven't paid attention maybe as much as we should to those voices, but I think it's easy to tell the bad side of some of the negative impacts of globalization, but there are many things we take for granted. And I think we just haven't really made the connection with the benefits of globalization and trade and how to continuously improve it. So I'd love to hear from all of you or anyone who cares to share what are the benefits that we're missing, and then how can we better harness those, particularly for smallholder participants? How can we make globalization or even regional trade work better for smallholder farmers? Love to hear from some of you with your experience.
Margaret, thank you very much. Let me come back to the panel here, and then in the next round, I will also, David, a heads up that we're going to come to you in the next round on trade. Let me start with the panel here.
Well, first of all, on the data question, as you've seen with the Facebook stuff the last 2 weeks, the issue is, will the private sector act responsibly, which apparently they didn't do in this case, or we don't know all the facts, and will people have trust in large institutions that what's coming out of the mouths of government leaders and private sector leaders is on the level, it's true, and it's in their interests? And if there is no trust, then all the data in the world isn't worth a damn. And this is a general problem with governments everywhere in the world. More and more, we just don't seem to have this belief that the leaders of our country are trustworthy. And some of that has to do with the political system. Some of it is just not true. Some of it's the nature of the media. But even the issue you talked about, which is the relationship between data on the farm and how data is communicated, is one that's based on trust and people believing that their private property is being properly protected. And I raise that. It's not because it's not just true here, it's true almost everywhere. On the question that you asked about global food security, the Congress has done a remarkably good job in this area. The President's budget proposed a 30% cut in a variety of State Department and AID functions and food aid, and on a bipartisan basis, the Congress has fought that. And Catherine and I and everybody have been working on that, and so it's just something that thankfully it's one of the few areas that people work together on and see the need for the United States engagement in the world. The real danger, and again I'm speaking as a U.S. citizen, is the U.S. disengagement from the world generally. because that opens the door for despots, and we generally tend to fight for the right things. Not always, but most of the time. So, but I think the Congress is pretty well situated and believes that the politics of extending the Global Food Security Act. They've even had many hearings on food aid reform. People want to do the right thing. There are a lot of competing interests here. This is one area where the Congress has really acted responsibly, and in a leadership role. And the final thing to Margaret is this: bad news is always monumental, and good news is routine. So if a steel worker loses his or her job in eastern Ohio, that is bad news. If people, let's say, gain employment through small business operations, they're able to export, it's just really harder to personalize that. The truth of the matter is, and I'll end with this idea that the United States is being taken advantage of by the rest of the world is ridiculous. Yeah, there are probably some ideas. There's no question that at times the Chinese have an export policy which is not necessarily favorable. But we are a strong country. Our economy is strong. The imports that we come in here help consumers, and we have a strong export economy. And if leaders of our country continually bash engagement in the world, it's just going to reinforce to average people that the system doesn't work. So all I can tell you, Margaret, because you're a real leader, and just keep on trucking there. Just keep on pushing. That's all we can do.
Yeah, let me just pick up on that question about the benefits of globalization. I mean, I think the anti-globalization backlash has forced us, those of us who've been writing papers about the benefits of globalization, to focus on what the real problem is. And I think it is picking up on what Dan was saying. It has to do with the transition. For every job destroyed by globalization, there are 2 jobs that are created. The trouble is, it's not the same people. And how do you turn the person who lost his job into somebody who can actually work in the new industry? And I think that's where the U.S. has actually done very badly, because the U.S. has very few instruments to facilitate that transition. All we really have is the Trade Adjustment Assistance Program, which is very weak, very small, and essentially doesn't take into account the fact that some people may not want to move from their location and a whole lot of other things. So actually, I think this has been a useful, if painful, realization that maybe we need to work on those transition arrangements if we want to capture the benefits of globalization.
First of all, I fully agree, Shanta. That's absolutely right, and that's what we did. We in the U.S. have not done well, is train people for their next potential assignment. I want to come back to Dan and just underline that food aid, humanitarian aid, and related issues have been bipartisan supported programs forever in the U.S. Congress, and Dan was one of the important members of that when he was in Congress. And then he and I had a really fun time being bipartisan leadership of this whole idea of the U.S. going back into food security. And ultimately, when the Global Food Security Act passed, it did exactly what you suggested in the question, to make sure this wasn't just a one administration program. So it's going to be really important that is again reauthorized this year. It comes up again this year. It's not controversial, but you never know what it gets behind or something that gets in the way. So please watch it if you care about this, and try to put in your thoughts if you're in the U.S. to your member of Congress or your senator about that reauthorization. What you will see now with the new food security reform being discussed, what you will see is a bipartisan push for reform on food aid and related issues. But you won't see unanimity, not necessarily on a partisan level, but more on a split between views of the foreign policy members of Congress and views of the agriculture members of Congress. So that's what's to watch in that context and where to look if you want to try to influence.
Danielle, did you want to make any remarks?
I don't think it's really going to answer any of the questions, but I do have a remark about this need for training as farmers are aging around the globe, and I think this will come up in the next few days at the Chicago Council event. But we have an aging population of farmers in the U.S. with the average age being 58.3 years old. In sub-Saharan Africa, it's 57 years old. So it's not only about training people for these sort of new advanced jobs, but it's getting youth back into farming and making farming cool again in different aspects of it, not just as farmers, although that's very much needed, but scientists and researchers, food entrepreneurs, those are all going to be sort of the jobs of the future if we invest in them and if we have that political will.
Thank you. Shane?
Yeah, on the data, yes, we used to have a program called Harvest Choice, well, not Harvest Plus, another program, Harvest Choice, that really tried to link the georeference data with household survey data to map poverty, hunger, malnutrition at household level with, let's say, the GIS type of data. I don't know whether we have anybody from that division. They are still in different buildings, so maybe by 3 weeks they will be in the same building. But I can ask Indira, who is the author of that paper, to give some comments on that. Nadim's question, I think it's not just your leadership in Congress, but also probably administration. To me, the bottleneck is with the administration. How can we really move from the Congress support to actual implementation from the administration side? That's something we are really struggling. Now, on the Margaret, I think, yes, that's exactly what Dan said. We have documented lots of benefits of migration, trade, but nobody reads it. But if you think that's a bad case, that everybody reads it. So that is a problem. How are we going to communicate good, positive news to everybody instead of just some, bad or weird news that, David is here, David Nabo, he has done quite a bit of work on the benefits of free trade or fair trade for the last 10 or 20 years. Tons of stories, tons of case studies. But again, how are we going to communicate?
Thank you very much, Shingen. I'd like to call on Indira for a few remarks on data, and then I will call on David Laborde for remarks on trade, and then online audience.
Yeah, thank you, Roger. So in IFPRI, we collect a lot of household and community level data. So while we want to make them as global public goods, we're not disclosing the geospatial information of the data. But your question is a very good question, and we are also facing a lot of problems in that area. So connecting remote sensing data with household information without breaking confidentiality is a challenge for us also in IFPRI. So offsetting geospatial information may be a way to go, but it may not be accurate as it should be. So we are facing that, and we are also looking into that. Yeah, thank you.
Big issue as we go forward. David, I would like to come to you, and Amanda, there's a mic. Yeah.
Excuse me, thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the panel and all the audience. I will have just a couple of comments. The first one is about not the good story about trade, but the bad story about trade. And just to say that we don't think that the world is pink. And for at least 100 years, just starting from the theory of economic science, we know that if you're in the US and you open your economy, capitalists are going to win, high-skilled workers are going to win, and low-skilled workers will have problems. And the main recommendation we do for the last 100 years is take care of these losers of trade liberalization, because you will create so much wealth with trade that you can redistribute. But you have to, with training programs, targeting these people, with different public good provision. But if you don't do it, you will have a backlash. So if you are opening your economy, you want more trade, and at the same time, you reduce redistribution, you redistribute taxes, you are going in a wall. Now, about the good stories for the smallholders. In many newspapers, sometimes you will see stories about how smallholders are facing unfair competition or harsh competition due to world markets. The reality we see in most of the developing countries is that many, and I would say even majority of smallholders, receive a lower price than the world markets, when the poor consumers still pay a higher price than the world market. So you have a lot of distortion within your country that cause this problem. You have a lack of competition, meaning that you have some local monopoly or oligopoly that make a rent on these smallholders. Through trade, you increase competition. Through trade, you are going to increase better input for the smallholders. So in many cases, smallholders are not connected enough to markets, and we want them to be more connected to get more opportunities. Thank you.
If we have online questions, if you do, yes, John, please go ahead. Amanda, please.
Yes, we have another data-related question from Professor Sumar Hasimoglu. Might it be worth revising or reevaluating the impact method and perhaps trying the age and gender-corrected per-adult human unit method? That's one question. From Tarina Underwood, I would appreciate it if Danielle could elaborate more on the call to break down silos. And finally, Syed Ishad Ali Shah would ask for comments about the China One Belt, One Road initiative, how it can help agriculture development. One example is the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which will help Pakistan in agricultural improvement.
Thank you. Before I come to the panel, let me see if there are any questions in the room, because this is the last round I will take before I come back to the panel. So if this is a moment for you to make your question come comment. And Asma, Melissa, please bring the mic to Asma. Do not be shy. This is the moment.
This is for Catherine. Thank you so much for raising the issue about nutrition being sort of siloed and left out. What in your view could be done to better integrate nutrition over this next nutrition decade?
Thank you very much, Asma. And I see a hand at the back there too.
Hello, this is Chelsea with Harvest Plus. I wanted to ask Danielle a little bit more about the local municipalities or the local governments and cities and how they are doing things that increase food security for their communities and how it's not capitalized in the media, or how we can just make their stories told and known and not focus so much at the national or the government level.
Thank you very much, Chelsea. And what I'd like to do is come back to the panel in reverse order. And then I'd also like to ask you, in this moment as you speak, if you want to react to the comments you heard from the other panelists, and also any final remarks you want to leave with the audience. Let me do that reverse round. Danielle, may I begin with you?
So let me address the question from the online audience about silos first. And I'll just give you a very personal example. So I come from the sustainable agriculture, that's my background. I studied at the Tufts Friedman School of Nutrition Science and Policy. I was a Peace Corps volunteer, very crunchy, hippie, on a lot of these issues when I first started working on the food movement and really researching and studying these issues internationally. And so for a long time, I personally, if you'd asked me, would you speak at IFPRI? Would you speak at, Cargill? Would you interact with different players? I would have said, no, I'm not doing that. And then, as sort of I grew up in this sector, I decided that, I made this really a New Year's resolution to myself that I would go to any sort of outside my comfort zone conference that I was invited to. So I started speaking at, like Bayer Crop Sciences annual conference. I went on a trip with Cargill. I interacted more with IFPRI and have, realized that we share more in common than we disagree on, and have done that with several different research organizations. I had the opportunity, I've had the opportunity to travel to so many of the CG centers and really learn from them and understand, that what they're trying to do in terms of whether it's, creating more access to data or doing the research that will help small farmers do their jobs better. That, there's no point in demonizing what we consider the other side, that these issues are not very black and white. They're actually really, really gray. And so I think that's the kind of message that my organization, Food Tank, wants to project to the world, that we need to be talking to everyone. Everyone needs to be involved in these conversations, and that we can't sort of, put each other in boxes, that we need to really understand and learn from one another. And then on the question around local food policies, I think, that there's this tendency to ignore them because they seem very small. But if you look at things like the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact, which has brought together cities all over the world now who are learning from one another about how to address food insecurity, how to address better access and affordability to food in places like Tel Aviv or Baltimore. These are really great examples that don't get a lot of play in the media. And so telling those stories, having other cities learn from those examples, when you see mayors and local food policy, you know, sort of czars and council members take the lead on these issues, that's fantastic. But again, those stories aren't being told, and the examples need to get out there in a much bigger way.
Let me come to you, Kat.
Thank you for asking about the silos of nutrition, agriculture, and health. When I was at the World Food Program, we created a mission statement and lots of sentences that ultimately ended with, our mission is to end hunger. And once we agreed that our mission was to end hunger, we said, well, how do we do that? And the answer was, well, we move food. We don't really end anybody's hunger. They have to consume the food in order to do that. Well, how do they consume the food? The answer was the cooks cook the food. And who are the cooks? And the answer was women. And we totally refocused our business plan then around women because they were going to be our partners in an effort to help end hunger. So with that kind of thinking, I would go into the agriculture sector and the health sector and say, what's our mission? So if we're growing food, why? I mean, except for the food that burns up to be made into fuel, we're feeding somebody, we're feeding animals or people. And so what's our purpose in doing that? What kind of concerns do we have about the quality of that food and the nutrient value of that food? And what's it going to mean for the different populations that might possibly consume it? I would say the same thing on health. I think the Gates Foundation talked about this way back a while ago, where they said, you know, we decided to vaccinate people and we decided to use different preventative programming, but then we realized that if people didn't have a strong enough constitution because they didn't have enough food to eat, that whatever we were doing on the health side was pretty irrelevant and a waste. So I'd ask the same question in health. What's our mission? And if our mission is to help make sure that humans are healthy, then how do we do that? And then nutrition is going to be a key part of that. But I don't think we get to nutrition that way either in agriculture or health. And unless it comes from the rationale for why this whole area exists, I think it's always going to be an add-on.
Thank you. Yes, this has been a very interesting discussion. Just one quick point about the data, the geocoded data. I mean, this conversation reminds me of the conversation we had 25 years ago when we were just doing household surveys, where there was concern about the privacy of the households just by reporting on their consumption and expenditures. And there were developments that enabled us to anonymize household survey data and still capture the richness. So I think it is a problem at the moment, but I think it can be overcome. The second is, I can't resist talking about the silos because we face similar problems at the World Bank. And I sometimes wonder whether these institutions like FAO, WHO, were created during a different they were created during a different era, but with a different view of the world, essentially, which was, and in fact, they refer to them as specialized agencies. The problems we have today are not specialized. And so it is very hard to retrofit institutions that were created under that rubric to the modern era. And I think what Schengen was saying earlier about examples like the IPCC, which were modern era, essentially virtual organizations. You don't have a building called the IPCC anywhere, I don't think. But they actually can be quite effective, and we may want to be thinking along those lines. And then finally, just a general comment on what my colleagues have been referring to as political will. it's easy to, it's tempting to say, you know, we need more political will to do something, as if it were a dial you can turn on and turn off. But that's not the way it works, right? I think the way it actually works is if the public, the general public, actually receives information that then enables them to make it, you know, evidence-based decisions, or there's an evidence-based debate in the country, and that then filters up to the political leadership. And there I want to come back and salute IFPRI, because this report is an example of that kind of information. Getting that information out to the public to help build that political will that we all seek. Thank you.
Great. It was Napoleon who said, war is too important to be left to the generals. Okay, so we're at IFPRI. My guess is virtually everybody in this room is related to the food and agriculture industry. Now, you're not the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, or you're not Davos. You probably go there. But one of the things I found is that the only people who talk about these issues are people who are either producing food or consuming food or distributing food. And yet it's the largest single part of the economy of the world. So the question is, how do you get a subject to some people who appears to be arcane? You ever talk about American farm programs or European farm programs? Oh my God, people's eyes glaze over within 14 seconds. All right, but how do you talk about these issues? How do you provide a narrative so that people who aren't producing food care about them? Or if they are producing food, they're producing it in a way that impacts their lives personally, like what Danny's doing and what others are doing at the local level. So I really do think that got to figure that one out. I just mentioned two other anecdotes. The whole issue of nutrition and health, which Catherine has taken such a leadership on. I served on a Council on Foreign Relations panel 2 years ago, and the issue was how to deal with non-communicable diseases in the developing world. Okay, it was a distinguished panel. Smart people, a lot smarter than I was, and we did through this report. And the report largely focused on two things: pharma, how to get drugs into the developing world, and tobacco control. Two very important issues. But nutrition was, I would say, an afterthought. And so here you had all these brilliant people in the health world and everywhere else not really focusing on this part of the issue. And the old French philosopher who said, you are what you eat, obviously hadn't gotten into these people's vocabulary before. I only mention that because, again, it relates that these subjects have to be highlighted beyond just people who are doing the work on a daily basis, finding different ways. That's why locally grown food, farmers markets, other things bring people in from other worlds into this, into this type of situation. Final point on governance, which is really critical, and you've all talked about. So I run this program at the Aspen Institute, and last month I was supposed to take 15 members of Congress to Ethiopia and Rwanda on a trip to look at smallholder agriculture and health issues and development issues generally. And a day before we were supposed to leave, a week before, the Prime Minister resigns. There's a general strike. There are tanks on the road. And the ambassador, this is in Ethiopia, not in Rwanda. This would not happen in Rwanda, I can tell you. And people wouldn't live if they did that kind of stuff. But any event, Ethiopia is one of the most important countries in Africa, and a lot of great things are happening there. So I talked to the ambassador, and he says, I do suggest you postpone your trip. Because he says, I can't guarantee that you'll get from the airport to the hotel. And even if you get to the hotel, I can't guarantee that you'll be able to go out and visit any site. So I mention this to you because the issue of governance, and it's global. Some places have done just a much better job. Some places that are doing a good job on some things are doing such a poor job at the corruption level and the governance level. And you can't do anything globally without dealing with corruption and governance issues.
Schengen, you have the final word.
Well, on the One Belt, One Road initiative, yes, the current Chinese aid usually is very much integrated into infrastructure investment, commerce, industry, all the things. But the good news is just about a week ago, China has set up a USAID equivalent agency called China Aid Agency. So that agency will coordinate all the aid policy from different ministries to set up the strategy, set up the vision, and a professional, will not be driven by, well, I think it's by politics, obviously not very difficult to go away from that, but definitely will be a very professional agency. Now the agriculture, food, nutrition will be very much part of that, and I'm happy to advise them on that issue. So One Belt, One Road, yes, it was an infrastructure initiative, but now they will go beyond that. So agriculture, food, nutrition definitely will be part of this through training, through research, through scholarships, and probably even impact evaluation. So that's on that side. Now on the governance, I think the global governance issue, the 3 room-based agencies, where you have 3 different councils. Obviously, they report different things. Is it possible just to merge 3 councils into one? Well, I know. And, you know, the CGI is struggling with the same issue.
Catherine is leading it.
That's right. Well, you do need to have that. So I think and also the nutrition issue. So how are we going to, I really like what Dan said. Nutrition is not just afterthought. Nutrition should be objective, should be a goal. Nutrition should be a driver. And I usually call it nutrition-driven policy, nutrition-driven agriculture, nutrition-driven investment, nutrition-driven research, instead of sensitive or whatever link. I think I very much agree at the community level. If we can use nutrition as an outcome to evaluate the performance of the local leaders, they will pay attention to it. Otherwise, why should I care?
Thank you very much. Before I call on you to thank our extraordinary panel, I would like to ask you, please continue this conversation. I think our panelists have made that plea in different ways, different words, the importance of keeping this conversation going, of highlighting examples, and of this discourse at this time when I think there's a lot of rhetoric out there of communicating some of the importance of trade, importance of policies, importance of governance, and so forth. We hope our report will help contribute to that conversation by you, by your partners and networks. We invite you to come and visit our website for all the different tools and resources that we have, and we hope that you will find this something important and engaging at this time. On that note, please join me to thank our incredible panelists and their views that they shared.